Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The residents of the Falkland Islands, or Malvinas, have spoken. They wish to maintain their status as a British overseas territory. Argentina has dismissed the referendum as folly. It would appear the twin pillars of the international order are on a collision course. Does self-determination trump the sanctity of sovereignty? To cross-talk this island dispute, I'm joined by Luke Coffey in Washington. He is a Margaret Thatcher Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Also in Washington, we have Willard Alejandro Sanchez. He is a Research Fellow at the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. And in London, we cross to Richard Gaut. He is a former Latin American correspondent and editor for The Guardian. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Richard, if I can go to you first. The recent referendum overwhelmingly passed, so we should recognize self-determination of those people living on those islands. Yes or no?
Definitely not. No, self-determination doesn't apply to a small group of people living on an island miles away from the mainland of Britain.
Okay, that was very clear. Luke, jump in.
Well, I tell you, it certainly does. It doesn't matter if it's one single person. They have the right of self-determination. It's clearly outlined in the UN Charter. This is a very fundamental right, and they have exercised this right, and the world should listen.
Okay, you guys are being real quick here. Alex?
I'll try to keep it short. For the past few years, the Argentine government has accused the UK of carrying out a policy of 21st century colonialism in the islands. I think the referendum was an interesting and important tool by the UK to show that the will of the islanders is being respected, and these are people that have lived in most cases for their entire lives in these islands.
Okay, Richard.
But Peter, I would say that it's not.
Let's go to Richard first. This is going to be very lively. Richard first, please. Go ahead.
And the problem is, it's not a question of what the islanders think. It's a question of the sovereignty of the islands and the sea around them, and that at present belongs to Britain, and it is claimed by Argentina. So the views and thoughts of the islanders are completely and absolutely irrelevant.
All righty, Luke, go ahead. Irrelevant.
That is not true. The wishes and the will of the islanders is very important here. This is what it's all about. It's about what do the people of the Falkland Islands want to live under. Do they want to live under the crown of the United Kingdom, or do they want to be part of Argentina? They've overwhelmingly decided that they want to be part of the United Kingdom. And this wasn't a tool by the United Kingdom, actually. This was the whole referendum idea came from the Falkland Islands government. It was the Falkland Islanders themselves that have the right of self-determination enshrined into their constitution. It's the Falkland Islanders themselves that have decided to exercise this right of self-determination. Now, David Cameron in London said that he would back the Falkland Islanders no matter what the outcome of the vote. And he has done so. And Argentina needs to listen. The people of the Falkland Islands want to remain British. Very clear.
Alex, is it an either-or situation here, as it was just described?
Pretty much. Unfortunately, we have to look at this from a historical perspective. I think both the government of Argentina and London have been fighting for control of the islands since the 19th century. Since 1833 is the date when the UK is accused of having expelled the Argentines that used to live in the islands, and they brought in their own people. And obviously, depending on who you ask, an Argentine or a British historian, they're going to tell you a different version of probably the same history. So obviously, both nations are not going to agree on some kind of sovereignty. Sovereignty is not on the table. The UK has obviously said that. And I actually disagree with what Luke said. I think this is a tool, especially because Argentina has been trying to get a sympathy vote from Latin America, from the developing world, by saying, oh, the UK are the evil country. They're trying to steal our lands. They're carrying out, like I said, this 21st century colonialism. And the UK is trying to, with this referendum, can go around and say, no, we're not imposing our will on anybody. The people that live in the islands are happy with their current relationship with the UK, and we're respecting that, and we'll protect that.
Luke, you wanted to jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, well,
Let me go to Luke first. Let's go to Luke first. Go ahead, Luke.
I find it shocking that, that there's a whole group of people around the world who simply want to ignore the wishes of the Falkland Islanders. I mean, this is an extension of a campaign by Argentina to dehumanize the Falkland Islanders. Quite regularly, we hear Argentine officials describe the Falkland Islanders as a population and not a people. The Argentine foreign minister a couple of weeks ago in London even went so far as to say that the Falkland Islanders did not exist. These are outrageous comments. These are the words of colonizers. And it's absurd to think that a country that's supposed to be a member of the G20, part of the democratic community in the world, would make these sort of claims.
Okay, Richard, jump in.
The Falkland Islanders, the people who live on the Falkland Islanders, do not constitute a people. They are British subjects who happen to live on the Falkland Islands. And it's worth saying that more than 30 years ago, the British government...
There are 3,000 people that live on these islands that would disagree with you.
Richard, go ahead. Keep going.
Yeah. Never mind. More than 30 years ago, the British government, including Mrs. Thatcher, were very keen on negotiating the future of those islands with Argentina. And they came very close to an agreement, which was spoilt by the Argentine military invading the islands. But the situation has not changed in those 30 years. The British ought still to be keen to negotiate sovereignty, because traditionally, over the 130 years in which the British have occupied the islands, the legal department of the Foreign Office has always had doubts as to the validity of the British claim. And so it's perfectly legitimate for the Argentines to suggest that there should be a dialogue about the future.
Okay, Alex, you look like you wanted to say something. Go right ahead. No, let's go to Alex. Alex first. Go ahead.
Yes. Just very quickly. Like I said, I've read the accounts by Argentine historians. They have their own version of what happened in these islands and why they have their claim to it. They say that they got the islands from the Spanish crown, I believe, after they got their independence, and then the UK came. So I think we can obviously here sit down and discuss 19th century historical facts for the next 2 hours and probably not come to an agreement. But I think what's important is that this referendum has humanized the Falklands dispute. It's not just about the land, it's not just about the oil, which and
we'll
the gas
talk about that in a second. We'll talk about that in a second.
Critical factor. Good. But it has humanized it because it has given a face to the dispute, saying it's not. Yeah.
Okay, Luke, go ahead, jump in.
Peter, I think it is worth actually exploring a bit of the history here. You know, what we now call Argentina today broke away from the Spanish Empire, declared independence in 1816. The last Spanish settlement on the Falkland Islands was 1811. So at the time of Argentine independence, Spain did not have de facto or sovereign control over the Falkland Islands. So the idea that Argentina would inherit something that Spain didn't even have to give is ridiculous. In 1833, when the British warship HMS Clio arrived to the Falkland Islands to reassert British sovereignty there, that was first declared in 1765, they expelled only the Argentine military garrison, 26 soldiers, 10 of whom were implicated in a recent murder at the time, were kicked off the islands. The Argentine civilians that were living there were free to stay, and many did so, in fact. So fast forward today, the history is interesting, but actually it's not that important. What is important is the will of the Falkland Islanders themselves. They have said they want to be British, and we should respect that.
Yeah, but they can be British, but why do they have to have... Okay, Alex, go ahead, jump in, go ahead.
I'm just going to say that I take exception with one word that Luke said when he said that the Argentine soldiers that were at the islands at the time were free to stay or leave the islands as they wish when the British came. I think that sounds really weird when it comes to like British imperialist history and how we see the world. I've never heard of these colonial empires from Spain, the UK, France, Holland giving much of an option to people that live in a land. They usually just make a decision for themselves and say, "Oh, we allow you to stay, or we want you to leave."
Okay, Luke, this is CrossTalk. Go ahead.
It was a fact that Argentine civilians were not only asked to and allowed to, but many did stay after 1833. And there was never an indigenous population on the Falkland Islands that were expelled by anyone. No. The first inhabitants of the Falkland Islands were European. So this idea that someone was kicked out and another power implanted people is absurd, and it's just not true. And this is the same line we hear over and over again from Buenos Aires, and it's simply false.
Richard, go ahead before we go to the break. Let me go to Richard.
Well, I'm afraid it's just not true. The British seized the islands in 1833 and subsequently settled it with settlers from Britain, from the Falkland Islands, from St. Helena. It was a British colonial project. In the,
okay, so Richard, they're colonizers.
That's not true.
For Richard, they're colonizers, right?
Absolutely right.
Luke?
Not true.
Alex?
It's simply wrong. It's historically inaccurate, and it cannot be backed up with any historical documents or data to prove.
Islanders.
Alex, go ahead before we go to the break.
The problem is that these islands never had an indigenous population to begin with. So obviously the question is, who got there first, who inhabited the islands for the longest time, and who has like a legal claim to them. Obviously, like I said, depends who you ask. You're going to get different accounts from the Spanish, the Argentines, the British, from the islands, the islanders themselves. I will simply call them islanders. I will not call them colonials or any indigenous. I will simply say they live there now, and they have done it for all their lives probably.
All right, Luke, before we go to the break, real quick, 30 seconds.
Yeah, well, I'll say that although the history of the Falkland Islands is important and there's a clear historical case for British sovereignty over the islands, it's actually secondary to the fact that the people of the Falkland Islands want to be British. And that's actually what we should be focusing on, is the fact that 99.8% of those that voted wanted to remain a British overseas territory.
All right, gentlemen, I have to jump in. We have to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on those disputed islands. Stay with our team. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing self-determination and the sanctity of sovereignty. Okay, Richard, I don't think anyone denies the Britishness of the people living on those islands, but why should it be their island?
The British government has always felt that it has a not very good claim to the islands, and I'd like to put that directly to Luke, because throughout the history of the islands, the British have been very, very nervous about the Argentine claim. And I went to the islands about 40 years ago with a British minister who was planning at those stages, at the end of empire, the wind-up of empire, to get rid of the islands. And we did get rid of the Chagos Islands, Diego Garcia, at the end of the 1960s, and we handed over the islands to the United States as a military base. At the same time, we tried to persuade the islanders to accept the idea that their future lay with Argentina, just as something like 250,000 British people of British descent, have always lived, or since the 19th century, have lived in Argentina, mainland Argentina.
Okay, Luke, so what makes these islands different then, considering what Richard just said?
Well, technically, Diego Garcia is a British overseas territory as well. It's not part of the U.S., although the U.S. does operate an air base there. But it goes back down to the simple fundamental principle of self-determination. It is true. Richard is correct in saying that these islands have had a complicated history. But the history does show that the British do have sovereign control over these islands, and the people want to keep it that way. You know, there was talk even in the 1970s of doing some sort of leaseback agreement between the UK and Argentina. And in fact, one of the UN resolutions that is constantly touted out by Buenos Aires, UN Resolution 2065 of 1965, actually called for this dispute, this territorial dispute, to be solved peacefully between Argentina and Great Britain. Well, 17 years later, after that UN resolution, Argentina evaded and illegally occupied the islands. And that was a game changer. In 1982, with that Argentine invasion, that was the game changer of the Falkland Islands. And Margaret Thatcher made it very clear after that invasion and after the islands were liberated that it is up to the people to determine their future. Because quite clearly, they want to remain British.
Alex, why doesn't Argentina... Okay, Richard, go ahead. This is CrossTalk. Go ahead.
Why do you argue that it was a game changer? Under international law, the invasion had no impact whatsoever on the basic dispute about sovereignty.
Luke?
Well, under international law, these UN resolutions that are continuously mentioned by Argentina are non-binding. And if they are binding in any sense, they're merely suggesting that the parties involved should settle this dispute peacefully. And as I said, the resolution of 1965, the UN resolution of 1965, that called for a peaceful resolution to the dispute, ended up in a war 17 years later by Argentina invading.
Okay,
so
Alex,
it's clearly...
Alex, jump in. Go ahead.
I think it's important to put some kind of general context, like we have just done with mentioning Diego Garcia and these other islands. There are still a lot of European countries that have overseas territories in the Western Hemisphere, besides the Falkland Islands. You have Bermuda, still part of the UK, where they can decide if they want to be independent or remain or maintain some kind of allegiance to London. You have Curaçao, Nauru, and the former Dutch Antilles, who are part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. You have Martinique and French Guiana, which are over Département d'Outre-mer from France. I mean, and you don't see this kind of debates and even a war that has started over these islands and these regions in the Pacific. Unfortunately, what happened with the Falklands after 1982, after the embarrassing defeat of the Argentine military, was that the claim for the islands became such a part of Argentine national identity that they, I mean, whether you can argue that they actually have a valid claim or the British have a stronger claim, but the Argentines believe honestly that the islands belong to them. So nothing, and you have these continuously nationalistic and sometimes aggressive statements by the Argentine government, especially during the Kirchner presidency, that say we're going to have the islands in 20 years and the British are evil and colonials and that kind of stuff. So, and that definitely doesn't support a situation or negotiations of any kind.
Okay, Richard, it is a big domestic issue in Argentina. Go ahead, Richard.
It is, and I mean, it's rather curious. It's a big issue for the Argentines. It's not a big issue for the British at all. Most of the time, most people in Britain don't give a single moment's thought to the Falkland Islands. The ridiculous thing is that there is a debate about sovereignty. Two countries claim these islands, and they should get together and have a discussion about what might happen. And that is what the British absolutely refuse to do. And I take the side of the Argentines. I think the Argentines are completely right to call for discussions so that this matter can be discussed amicably and peacefully.
Okay, that's fair enough. Luke, you want to respond to that?
There's nothing to discuss here. As far as the UK is concerned, as far as the Falkland Islanders are concerned, this matter is settled. The Falkland Islanders voted overwhelmingly to be part of Great Britain, and we should respect that.
Okay, Alec?
Sure. I'm just going to say that right now, this issue is not going to be solved anytime soon. You have the Argentines are pretty stubborn on their point of view. You have the British have their own point of view. The Falklanders have spoken their mind. But I think it's important to mention, and I know we haven't talked about the oil and the natural resources yet, but I think it's important to mention that cooperation between the two countries over the islands has existed as early as the late 1990s, where both countries signed a number of fishing agreements, the joint search for hydrocarbons and that kind of stuff around the islands. And unfortunately, a lot of these accords have been canceled since. But cooperation between these two countries has existed before, and it should happen again. And I understand that the Falklands, the sovereignty over the islands is going to continue to be an issue of debate and an issue that's going to be very sensitive, especially for the Argentines. Again, obviously, winners, there's a saying that I guess I'm just about to come up with, that winners get to write history, but the losers hold grudges.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's going on right now.
Pete.
Okay, Luke, oil was mentioned
I
there.
think
Okay, let me go to Luke. Oil was mentioned. Is it about oil and fish? Go ahead, Luke. Go ahead.
Well, it's not about oil. That's a very convenient distraction for those who can't build a proper case on why the island should be Argentine. If there is oil there, which many think that there is, there's probably going to be a lot of it. And at the end of the day, this oil is not going to belong to Great Britain. It's going to belong to the Falkland Islands government. So this idea that Britain wants to hold on to the islands for oil is equally ridiculous.
Well, it sounds
but I wanted to go back to a point that Richard made earlier, that no one in the UK cares about this issue. People certainly care about this issue, and they care even more when we see the sort of campaign of intimidation by Argentina against the Falkland Islanders. You know, when Secretary of State John Kerry went to London and had his first press conference as Secretary of State, the very first question asked by British media was about the U.S. position on the Falkland Islands. Of all the issues going on in the world today, that was the very first question asked by the British media.
Okay, Richard, jump in.
yes, of course it was, because they knew that they could needle the British, because traditionally the British and the Americans are supposed to be friends. But on this case, the Americans are neutral between Britain and Argentina.
Not
and
neutral.
indeed, at the start of the Falklands War, Ms. Kirkpatrick, the American delegate at the UN, was decidedly in favor of Argentina. So this has been a sort of
neutral.
open wound.
The US
and indeed, I think one of the purposes of the recent referendum is to use it as a propaganda point in the United States, and I'm sure, Luke, that you will be active in that, in trying to persuade the Americans to side with the British and not with Argentina.
All right, Alex, you wanted to say something.
I'm simply trying to persuade Americans to back self-determination.
Let me go to Alex. Go ahead.
I will add that I believe that probably the British media asked that the first question to Secretary of State Kerry, because right now the referendum is the hot topic that's going on right now. It's been going, and the Falklands dispute has warmed up, unfortunately, heated up in the past couple of years, ever since. Last year in 2012 was the 30th anniversary of the war, which happened in 1982. So it was a very sensitive issue for both sides. Now, to what degree can we say that it's the critical factor in Argentina and for the Argentine media and for the British media and for the British population? You probably will want to have a couple of polls about that. I think there are a lot of problems going on in Argentina with its economy that probably take a little bit of precedent, but certainly, like I mentioned before, it's the dispute over the islands is something that's very close to the Argentine national identity. When it comes to the British side, the British have a pretty long history, arguably, or no, at least we can all agree on that, hopefully. And arguably, the Falklands War is not as sensitive as a topic as other issues. It has heated up right now, but it doesn't mean that it's going to continue like this for the long term.
Richard, I'm going to give you the last word in the program. Has anything changed after this referendum? Anything changed on the ground? 20 seconds.
No, I'm afraid nothing has changed at all. I don't think it's a question of self-determination. Of course, Argentina would be keen to accede to the wishes of the islanders to maintain their way of life, but it isn't possible for this to interfere with the need for the British and the Argentines to talk about the future of the islands.
All right, gentlemen, we've run out of time. Fascinating discussion. I thank you all. Many thanks to my guests today in London and in Washington. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules. Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The residents of the Falkland Islands, or Malvinas, have spoken. They wish to maintain their status as a British overseas territory. Argentina has dismissed the referendum as folly. It would appear the twin pillars of the international order are on a collision course. Does self-determination trump the sanctity of sovereignty? To cross-talk this island dispute, I'm joined by Luke Coffey in Washington. He's a Margaret Thatcher Fellow at the Heritage. Irrelevant.
That is not true. The wishes and the will of the islanders is very important here. This is what it's all about. It's about what do the people of the Falkland Islands want to live under. Do they want to live under the crown of the United Kingdom, or do they want to be part of Argentina? They've overwhelmingly decided that they want to be part of the United Kingdom. And this wasn't a tool by the United Kingdom, actually. This was the whole referendum idea came from the Falkland Islands government. It was the Falkland Islanders themselves that have the right of self-determination enshrined into their constitution. It's the Falkland Islanders.
Luke, jump in.
Well, I tell you, it certainly does. It doesn't matter if it's one single person. They have the right of self-determination. It's clearly outlined in the UN Charter. This is a very fundamental right, and they have exercised this right, and the world should listen.
Okay, you guys are being real quick here. Alex?
I'll try to keep it short. For the past few years, the Argentine government has accused the UK of carrying out a policy of 21st century colonialism in the islands. I think the referendum was an interesting and important tool by the UK to show that the will of the islanders is being respected, and these are people.
Foundation. Also in Washington, we have Willard Alejandro Sanchez. He is a research fellow at the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. And in London, we cross to Richard Gaut. He is a former Latin American correspondent and editor for The Guardian. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Richard, if I can go to you first. The recent referendum overwhelmingly passed, so we should recognize self-determination of those people living on those islands. Yes or no?
Definitely not. No, self-determination doesn't apply to a small group of people living on an island miles away from the mainland of Britain.
Okay, that was very clear.
That have lived in most cases, for their entire lives in these islands.
Okay, Richard.
But Peter, I would say that it's not.
Let's go to Richard first. This is going to be very lively. Richard first, please. Go ahead.
And the problem is, it's not a question of what the islanders think. It's a question of the sovereignty of the islands and the sea around them, and that at present belongs to Britain, and it is claimed by Argentina. So the views and thoughts of the islanders are completely and absolutely irrelevant.
All righty. Luke, go ahead.